Hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and tell you a little bit about immigrant students' education and provide an overview from the OECD, but a little bit Japan in a comparative perspective. So just to tell you a little bit where this is situated, so at the OECD I lead a project which is called Education for Inclusive Societies, and that was started a few years ago because countries were very interested for us to work both on equity and inclusion in education, and particularly the role that education can play for developing more inclusive societies. And this is actually a follow-up project to a project which was called Strength for Diversity, which we had for a number of years. And for the first couple of years, we looked only at the integration of immigrant and refugee students. And then we have expanded it a bit to look also at other dimensions of diversity, different students with diverse learning needs. And we published two big synthesis reports. One was very much looking at education and migration. And then recently, this came out last year, was on equity and inclusion in education. So to tell you a little bit about how this is all interlinked. So there's many dimensions of diversity, but we in the end decided on 6 based on feedback from countries. Migration, of course, is one of them, but we have also been looking at issues such as gender, dimensions such as special education needs, gifted students, gender identity, sexual orientation, and also ethnic groups and national minorities and indigenous populations. And many of these dimensions intersect, so can make a difference, for instance, when you have female migrant students which has a special education need, might necessitate different support and different type of help than, for instance, a male refugee student who is also gifted. And there are different policy areas that in a way need to be taken into consideration that are very much interlinked. And they range from governance, so what are the regulatory frameworks, who is responsible for supporting diverse students, what kind of education provision is provided. Then resourcing is also very important. What are some of the main and targeted allocation mechanisms to support students? Capacity building, another very important policy area. So how are teachers, school leaders, non-teaching staff trained and supported? Educational intervention, so what happens, for instance, in the schools or in the higher education institutions, how are the resources allocated? What kind of teaching practices are provided in classrooms? What kind of non-instructional support is provided in terms of counseling, but also career guidance? And how are parents and communities engaged? And then the last one, a very important one, is also monitoring and evaluation. So how are different outcomes monitored and how are policies and practices evaluated? And this then, what happens in education has implications then for individual and societal outcomes, both in terms of academic outcomes, also socio-political outcomes, for instance, political participation or trust in government institutions or trust in other people, economic outcomes, particularly labor market outcomes, and also well-being outcomes in terms of physical and mental health. And these outcomes then directly link to the development of inclusive societies. So to tell you a little bit about the percent of immigrant students in Japan and OECD countries, this is based on the recent 2022 OECD data, PISA, the Program of International Student Assessment. And this is 15-year-old students. They're assessed in a number of areas. There are few students with immigrant background in Japan, but this is the students that actually took the PISA test. So you see Japan here kind of on the far right, very small percentage. When you compare it, it's still a little bit higher than in Korea, at least from those that took the test, but very small compared to countries such as Switzerland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, countries that have, of course, had immigration policies for a very long time. And this is also then shown in the students that take the test. The language spoken at home by immigrant background, 2/3 of students with an immigrant background do not speak Japanese at home. This is quite a high percentage in comparison. much higher than the OECD average, but there are still some countries there where it's even higher. And then this can have implications. And we've heard in the previous presentation about that there is a lot of support for language learning in Japan. So when we look at reading performance, students with immigrant background in Japan, they underperform the Japanese students, but this difference actually disappears once we take into consideration socioeconomic background and language spoken at home. So you'll see in the blue bar, this is kind of the difference between immigrant and non-immigrant students. So the non-immigrant students do better than the immigrant students, but once we take into consideration the language spoken at home and the socioeconomic background of the students, actually the difference disappears. So this explains a lot the differences in reading performance. In mathematics, actually the differences are insignificant, both before accounting for socioeconomic background, language spoken at home, and after. So it explains less the gap between immigrant and non-immigrant students. We've looked also for many years at the outcome students with an immigrant background. This did not incorporate Japan at that point, but there is quite a lot of differences across countries and within countries. So there's differences between, of course, immigrant native students and also between different immigrant groups. So it's not only first generation and second generation of students, but it is also, we have looked at students from mixed households. So one parent is foreign born and one is native born. And the fourth group we have looked at is returning foreign born students. So this in your case would be Japanese students who are born abroad and then return back to Japan. There's also quite a lot of differences between early and late arrivals. So late arrivals are defined as those who come to the host country from the age of 12 and above. The outcomes are much better for students who come before the age of 12 for learning acquisition and generally integration and inclusion. Students with an immigrant background, on average, across OECD are at increased risk of academic underperformance, weak sense of belonging to school community, and also low life satisfaction. But needless to say, there are some countries where, for instance, the immigrant students outperform the native students. But many of the immigrant students show high levels of motivation. This is particularly the case for first-generation immigrant students. So it is very important to support and keep these motivational students, because once you get to second generations, their motivation is much lower. They've maybe not been able to achieve everything they had hoped for and might become disengaged. The disparities in outcomes that happen in schools, they persist into adulthood. So when we look at academic outcomes, there's generally, across most countries, low participation in early childhood education and care, which is also a very important education level. There's often below minimum reading proficiency. There can be also kind of segregation in specific schools, but as I mentioned, there is higher motivation expectations. In terms of social outcomes, there can be later on lack of social inclusion, experience in discrimination and threats, also worse mental health and sense of belonging. And when we look at economic outcomes, there's a figure looking at unemployment rates by immigration status and gender. Unfortunately, we do not have this data for Japan, but in many of the countries, it is actually the men and the women foreign-born who have much higher unemployment rates than the men and women who are native-born, although there are some exceptions to this case as well. So there's generally lower labor market activity rates. There can be also skills mismatch, higher unemployment risk, and dependence on social welfare. And not to forget societal outcomes. There's often also loss in productivity, lower innovation, economic growth, lower potential fiscal contributions. So what happens early on can then have important consequences also for later on, not only for the immigrants themselves, but also for the societies. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about holistic model for the educational integration newcomer students that I developed. It's trying to look at different learning, social, emotional needs, and I will get to them in a second in a bit more detail. But in order to achieve educational integration, it is actually very important to meet all, or at least most of the needs of the newcomer students. And there are various individual, interpersonal, and school level factors that can influence kind of the prevalence of these needs. The individual factors are, for instance, language proficiency, actually in both host country language, but also in the mother tongue, physical, mental health of the newcomers. In interpersonal factor, we have connection with peers, so how well are they connected to other people? What kind of family support and social networks exist? And in the more institutional, if we look at the school level factors, there is, for instance, the learning environment, the school engagement, the student-teacher interactions, in assessment in schools, also extracurricular activities, and the family involvement in schools. And then there is a variety of policies and practices that can shape these factors. So, as I mentioned, the newcomer students have particular needs, and we have also heard about it in the previous presentations. There are a variety of learning needs, for instance, learning the host country language, but also developing the mother tongue, overcoming interrupted schooling or limited education in many cases, adjusting to a new education system, to a new culture, to new norms, to a new environment. There are also social needs that need to be met, such as necessity to communicate with others, also bonding with others and feeling a sense of belonging, and also developing a strong personal identity. And in terms of emotional needs, it's very important, of course, to feel safe. Also, in many cases, coping with separation, for instance, from relatives. Some have experienced also loss and trauma, and all of these needs need to be met. So to give you some examples, for instance, in learning needs, in Finland, in the first year, they have an individual curriculum which is designed for each student, tailored to his or her needs, and they take into consideration things like age, also the educational history. It's very much based on discussions also with the parents and the teachers. In Sweden, all new arrivals are assessed in the students' mother tongues, and based on these results, the principal or head teacher determined the best educational trajectory, which is also regularly updated. In terms of social emotional needs, for instance, in Greece, there is a cross-thematic curriculum which focuses on social emotional learning through projects, self-assessment, and key skills such as critical thinking and effective communication. It also includes parents in the educational process. Whole school approaches are also very important. So, example from the Netherlands, where there's Sloven, this is the support for newcomer education, and it works with primary, secondary schools and takes a whole school approach to addressing learning social emotional needs. And it supports teachers, also municipalities, school boards, and local authorities. And extracurricular activities are also very important because they provide the opportunities to engage with others, also learn the language and learn about the environment in more informal ways. And there are many examples of activities such as sports, music, drama, and many other ones. So access to education for immigrant students is actually most OECD countries offer compulsory education to immigrants, refugees, and oftentimes undocumented individuals as a legal right. So to give some examples, in France, all children must attend school from ages 3 to 16, and regardless of nationality or legal status. However, if they are not French-speaking, they are evaluated by the Academic Center for Education of Newcomers and Travelers Children, and that allows the teachers to place the children in a dedicated language learning initiation class. In Germany, also compulsory schooling does not depend on nationality and applies to a foreign national stateless person between ages 6 and 15. And similar to France, the newcomers who do not speak German, they undergo specialized language integration classes for certain limited number of years, and the goal is to include them in regular school classes as soon as possible. And in the United Kingdom, all children also must attend primary, secondary education, and it is also compulsory, free of charge. And parents do not have to prove their immigration status, so they have the same rights to school place as any other children who are resident. course, there are also challenges to access education. Some of the challenges are linked that particularly in the education level, it is not compulsory. So in many countries that it's the early childhood education care, or it can be also beyond compulsory education. So some countries past 15, 16, it's no longer a requirement. So there are times barriers to assessing those education levels. For some immigrant children, their education has been interrupted by moving through school year. They can be also experiencing unstable housing, dealing with language skills, etc. And there might be also limited capacity in local schools or reception classes. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of supporting language learning and reducing socioeconomic differences. Actually, in some countries, the language is a very important factor in explaining the differences in academic performance and sense of belonging. So here, providing language-specific training is very important. In other countries, the social background plays a very important role in explaining differences. And here, targeting these differences is key. And actually, in some countries, both of those factors are important. And in some, actually, none of these two explain very much the differences. So it's a bit back, but we try to also put different countries into categories. We didn't have data for Japan at that point. But you see that for some of the countries, for instance, such as Croatia and Hong Kong at that point, and Luxembourg, socioeconomic status and language were relatively important, which could also perhaps expect in Japan. And in some countries, it's different factors play a more important role, and in some it is actually very hard to determine what are the key factors to explaining these differences. So I already mentioned supporting language training, assessing the language and other skills. And it is important to provide an accurate assessment of the skills in both mother tongue and the language of instruction. And I provided already some examples from Sweden and from Finland. In Sweden, also to mention that there's a program to supporting teachers to assessing the language abilities of new arrivals as well. Of course, teachers also are very important stakeholders. They also need to be supported. They can feel sometimes overwhelmed. They try to welcome and teach newcomer students. They might also benefit from diverse training and programs, and there are some examples across OECD countries. For instance, in Austria, at the national level, there are these mobile intercultural teams, which are made up of a teacher, social worker, and a psychologist, and they go and visit schools with high percentage immigrant students, and they provide specific support to teachers and administration. Then we also have a number of examples from, for instance, schools of education. So there's one at Indiana University in the US, which has cultural immersion programs for trainee teachers. In Finland, one of the big universities, University of Oulu, created also a combined bachelor master's degree in intercultural teacher education. And these are very important because we know from the PISA data that there is actually high need expressed by teachers for training, particularly in areas of teaching multicultural settings, second language teaching, intercultural communication, and equity and diversity. So there's more to be done. There is also challenges, of course, for schools in adjusting. So it's not only the immigrant students who need to adjust and need support, it's actually also the native populations that can experience potential challenges and need support. So schools need to ensure that all students have the cognitive, social, emotional skills that are needed to interact also with each other. And this becomes particularly important in multilingual, multicultural classrooms. And so in order to benefit from migration, policies, practice need to support the acquisition of skills and competencies among immigrant communities. They also need to promote overall social emotional well-being of migrants, recognize the differences in migration-related experiences. So migrants are a very diverse group with different needs and different experiences. And they also need to build the skills necessary to deal with psychological behavior challenges induced by acculturation, and this is for both immigrants and natives. So just to sum up, so some policy lessons for holistic education: providing access to all levels of education is very important, introducing early assessment and individualized learning plans, offering flexible learning and pathways and transitions, and also providing language support for development of language host country and mother tongues. So even the development mother tongues is very important because that can then help with actually the learning of second language and also with cognitive skills. Ensuring supportive learning environments that is compatible with students' cultures and identity formation, promoting social interactions, having whole school and whole community approaches, and also building capacity for inclusive teaching and increasing diversity in the teaching force. So this is also quite a priority in many countries, having more teachers, for instance, with immigrant background. So just some sources, and here I also referred you to our latest synthesis report and many other topics that are on our website. And the synthesis report is, there's a Japanese translation coming, I think in June or July this year, so be also hopefully accessible to audience in Japan. So thank you very much for your attention.